I want to talk a little bit about how my views on hell have changed over the years. If you want to read a little bit more about my own theological autobiography, check out my book, What's So Confusing About Grace, which I have linked in the show notes below. So, growing up, my view of hell was the eternal conscious torment view. I was presented it as the Christian view, which, of course, is a common experience for people, that this is the only way they're given to think about hell, that it is a place of unyielding, unending torment and punishment imposed by God. One significant factor, however, growing up, is that I also didn't have any clear understanding of the resurrection. I understood the resurrection of Jesus, of course. Every good evangelical does. But the really interesting irony is, as with so many evangelicals, I didn't grasp the real significance that the resurrection of Jesus was the first fruits of our resurrection, as Paul describes it in 1 Corinthians 15. Instead, I thought that when you die, if you followed Jesus, if you were in relationship with him, if you'd prayed a sinner's prayer and had had a day of conversion, then you would go to heaven when you died. And that was the picture. I went then to university, to a Christian university, having been raised in a Christian Pentecostal home with no clear understanding of the resurrection in the afterlife. And here's the great irony, and maybe a little bit of the great shame. I wasn't really challenged on my understanding of the doctrine of the resurrection of Jesus until I met a couple of Mormon missionaries. At the time, I was taking an apologetics class in university. I think this is either the spring of 1994 or the spring of 1995. And my roommate and I were getting really excited about wanting to debate Mormons. So, well, I shouldn't say that. We were just excited about wanting to debate anybody. But then Mormons happened to come to our door one day. And so we invited them in to have what they thought was an opportunity to share the gospel, but what we thought was an opportunity to debate them. And I began to pull out all my apologetic arguments that I'd been learning in my apologetics class. Well, the one Mormon missionary, she looked at us like this and she said, "What was your real purpose in inviting us here today?" But anyway, the other piece that came out of that, apart from the fact that I was a pretty obnoxious and ham-fisted young apologist at the time, was that at one point that missionary also said to me, "Don't you believe in the resurrection?" And I don't recall what prompted the question, but I do recall in the context, I understood that she wasn't referring to the resurrection of Jesus. She was referring to something else. And so I bluffed. I said, "Yeah, of course." And then afterwards, I think she had referenced 1 Corinthians 15. So I went and read the passage, and I'm like, how am I in like my second year or third year, whatever it was, of university, doing a double major in English and religious studies, and I'm unfamiliar with this chapter? And then from there, that prompted me to do a further inquiry and to realize the resurrection of God's people is the central hope of Christian eschatology. Christian theology of end times. It's not going off to heaven in the sky when you die. It's rather the corporeal bodily resurrection. And thus, the resurrection of Jesus wasn't just a one-off party trick to confirm that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, although that certainly would have been significant in and of itself. But no, it was something even far more significant than that. It was the miracle that was anticipated by Jews at the end of history coming into the middle of history. The illustration I like to give down to today of this concept of the first fruits is a fruit illustration. I grew up in the Okanagan in south central British Columbia, Canada, which is a major fruit growing region in Canada. We grow peaches and cherries and apricots and apples and grapes and all sorts of other good things, pears. And I always say, imagine if suddenly the first fruits for the crop from the next summer and fall suddenly is brought to you in January. In January, someone brings a basket of fruit and says, "This cornucopia of grapes and cherries and apricots and apples and pears is the first fruits of that which is going to be realized this summer." I mean, that would make no sense, right? It doesn't make sense. Everything is frozen outside. It's snow covered. We're still in the midst of winter. It's January. You cannot have fruit now. But that is what the resurrection presented for first century Jews, is the event at the end of history being initiated in the middle of time. The first fruits of our future resurrection coming into time with Jesus. And that is pretty amazing. And I didn't realize that. And I frankly have a Mormon missionary to thank for prompting my inquiry into this doctrine, because I didn't have any clear teaching of it. At least I missed it growing up in Sunday school and youth group and church, and for the first couple years of university. The other side of this positive doctrine is that there is also a negative side to it. It is anticipated in Daniel 12:2, which refers to a resurrection both of the righteous and the unrighteous. Jesus refers to it in John chapter 5, verses 25 and 28. The idea that at the end of history, there will be a resurrection not only of those who are righteous, found right to be righteous, as a Christian would say, in Christ, but also those who are outside Christ, the general resurrection of those persons. So this prompted then an additional change to my understanding of the doctrine of hell. That the doctrine of hell wasn't simply you die, and then you go off as an immortal soul, and you suffer as an immortal soul in hell forever. But no, you exist in an intermediate state, and then you are resurrected with a body restored, your body restored to life, but to be subjected now to punishment eternally. Punishment both in terms of your body, your physical body, and also your mental life. Now, another aspect of this whole picture of hell that I had up to that time, from the immortal soul days up to the general resurrection of hell days, was that hell was also a place of literal fire, because we were hopeless biblical literalists. And I don't mean that in a condescending way, but we just had never been given any other categories growing up with how to read this. So when you have Jesus talking about an outer darkness and a fiery furnace, well, we thought that you combine those images and think it is a place of literal black fire. And the lake of fire is a place of literal black fire and billowing smoke. And whether you are an immortal, disembodied soul suffering in the flames somehow, not sure how that would work, but somehow, or whether you are a resurrected person, as I later come to believe, roiling about and in hell, you are going to suffer forever in this literal flame. So that's where I was in spring. I actually think it was probably 1995. Another thing happened, however, at this time, same semester, same class, Christian apologetics, is we were given the opportunity to do a debate. So part of the class assignment was that you had to debate other people in the class on some topic. And for many people, that meant doing a devil's advocate debate. So a devil's advocate debate is where you argue a position different than the one you hold. So you're playing devil's advocate, as it were. You're adopting the role of the accuser or the alternative position to the one you hold and defending that in debate. And I ended up doing the doctrine of hell. And I opted to do, and it was a partner debate. And so me and my partner debated, my partner was Peter, and we debated Brad, who is a friend of ours, and then another person on the doctrine of hell. And Peter and I together, we defended the annihilationist position of the doctrine of hell, which we were just becoming familiar with. And Brad and the other fellow that he was teamed up with defended eternal conscious torment. So at this point, I began to study what annihilationism is. Now, here's where I'm going to say that this is where my love of not only debates is really born. Well, actually, let me just do an aside. In this same semester, 1994, or 95, whichever it was, I first also met William Lane Craig. He came to our classroom and gave us a presentation. I also watched him in debate. I believe he was at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. So almost 30 years ago now, I first heard him lecture. And that's where we became really interested in debate. So that's where my love of debates was born. But in this semester and in this particular assignment, my love also specifically of devil's advocate debates was born, because I came to recognize that I learned an enormous amount about a topic by committing to defend the topic that I didn't hold. So I committed to defending annihilationism. That meant reading people like John Stott and Edward Fudge and Michael Green, let's see, Philip Hughes, and one or two other voices that were annihilationist, as well as people from the opposing view. Oh, Clark Pinnock was one of the most significant ones from an annihilationist perspective. The Zondervan book, Four Views of Hell, had just recently come out, so I read that, including the annihilationist position of Clark Pinnock. And Clark Pinnock uses some really strong rhetoric there. For example, talking about eternal conscious torment as equivalent to God maintaining an eternal Auschwitz where the smoke of their torment rises forever, that kind of very provocative imagery. And I think that we really did well in the debate. But what's more important is in committing to defending the annihilationist position, which I should probably define for you, it was now combined with the doctrine of resurrection, which I had recently acquired. And it was the view that when you die, God resurrects you to a judgment that will ultimately result in the cessation of your existence. So you will not be subjected to perpetual torment forever. And so that now became my view. I discovered by the end of the debate that I actually believed this. I was committed to this view. And so that was a major significant development in my view. I was now an annihilationist. Although I would say close to 30 years ago, annihilationism or conditional mortality was still a very much a minority position and relatively provocative position within evangelicalism, although I learned in doing the debate that it had roots back into the patristic era and had always been a minority position in the church and had a very large, if not outsized, imprint in particular within British Anglicanism. All of these things I learned at the time. And so this was an example of my developing theology. I now accepted a general resurrection, but then I began to see that eternal conscious torment was not only, I thought, an incorrect doctrine based upon a concept of an immortal soul, and I think some pretty bad arguments in terms of dealing with things like moral intuitions on the relation between hell and heaven and other matters. But I came to recognize that, no, I was going to hold this other view, and I didn't have to have this to be a stumbling block in the same way or to the same degree that it had been previously. Now, my views on other issues continued to develop, but I would say the next major development for me was also coming to the position of being a hopeful universalist. What that means is that while I continue to believe in a resurrection to judgment that results in the cessation of existence of some persons, insofar as these are persons who are recalcitrantly opposed to God and God's kingdom, I also hold out hope that, in fact, I am wrong, and in fact, that all people will ultimately be reconciled to God in Christ. And I'm not sure where that belief really developed. I try to do some intellectual archaeology and reflecting on this, and I think a lot probably changed in the 2000s. I know that around 2009 or 10, I read Robin Perry's book published under the pen name Gregory MacDonald called The Evangelical Universalist, and I was reading some other universalist writings around the same time, and probably that's when I said I'm not persuaded by their arguments, but I certainly hope that they're correct. So that when I published my 2013 book on heaven called What on Earth Do We Know About Heaven, I concluded the book with a very strong endorsement, I think, of hopeful universalism. And here's just a brief explanation. So we really need, if we're going to talk about universalism, to distinguish it from things like pluralism, which is that there are many roads to the top of the mountain. Some people are saved by Jesus, some are saved by Buddha, whatever. That's not the view. And it's also not the view that there's no hell. Rather, it is the view that there is a hell. There's a place of posthumous judgment, a judgment in the afterlife following the resurrection. I mean, technically, you could have it as prior to the resurrection, but either way, it's some place in the afterlife of punishment, but it is a punishment that is restorative in nature, that is intended to restore creatures back into relationship with God and one another. And just to deal with, the worst objection, well, then why did Jesus die if everybody's saved? Well, Jesus died precisely so that everybody could be saved. If a cure is effectual at curing everybody in the population, the question then isn't, well, then why give them the cure? because the cure is effectual at saving everybody. That's why you give them the cure. Why did Jesus die? To save everybody. That's the logic on the universalist position or the universal restoration position. But I came to appreciate at this time that there also, just as with annihilationism, as I discovered in the 90s, so I discovered in the 2000s that universalism had a well-established minority voice throughout church history as well. And so my position on universalism is equivalent to my position on having a lottery ticket. Let's say that you have a lottery ticket for a $10 million lottery or whatever. So you would not think, based upon the 1 in 10 million odds, that you will win the lottery. But based upon the fact that there's at least a possibility that you could win, you ought to hope that you will win, right? Makes sense. You ought to hope that you will win. And even if you believe that the evidence for universalism or universal restoration is very weak, maybe it's only 1 in 10 million likelihood that it is true, still, nonetheless, you ought to hope it is true. I always give the quote from J.I. Packer: if you want to see people in hell, there's something wrong with you. The paraphrase, but that's the gist of what he said. And Packer held to eternal conscious torment, but I think he recognized it is deeply malformative of Christian discipleship if you want to see people in hell. And if that is malformative, then it means that proper formation of a Christ follower is that you ought to hope that everybody is saved, even if it turns out that it is not possible that everybody will be saved. And so that brings me to where I am now, after 30 years of theological development and reflection, is a annihilationist and hopeful universalist. Now, to conclude this video, I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that I am a theologian within the North American Baptist tradition. I've been the systematic theologian at Taylor Seminary, which is a North American Baptist school and is now part of Kairos University, and I've been there for 20 years. But interestingly, in the North American Baptist Statement of Beliefs, it takes what seems to be an endorsement of eternal conscious torment as part of the Statement of Belief. So I want to just take a look at that and then offer some theological reflections on how I, quote unquote, square the circle, as it were. Okay, here we are at the North American Baptist Statement of Beliefs. So if we scroll down here, let's go to here, section 9. The dead will be raised. Christ will judge mankind in righteousness. The unrighteous will be consigned to the everlasting punishment prepared for the devil and his angels. The righteous, in their resurrected and glorified bodies, will receive their reward and dwell forever with the Lord. This statement appears to commit a person to is a general resurrection to eternal conscious torment for those in hell. It doesn't require a literal hell, as I believed, and it certainly is not even consistent with hell as an immortal soul, but it is hell as a eternal conscious torment. So what should I think of this, and how can I be a theologian at a Taylor Seminary, a North American Baptist school, when I don't accept eternal conscious torment? This is important. It's an important theological question, and honestly, there's not like a simple answer, but let me give you the gist of the answer. So the first thing would be to point out, by the way, there's a typo right here. It should be Matthew 25 : verses 41 and 46. In fact, there's a typo here as well, right? This should be a Revelation 20, should be a colon, not a semicolon. Now that might seem churlish for me to point that out, but it's actually, I think, worth pointing out that this is a fallible human document. And if it's fallible in terms of having the wrong punctuation, maybe it could be fallible in other areas as well. It is a human document. It's not Holy Writ. Okay, it's a human document, but still you got to say, yeah, but it is the document that defines the confessional beliefs of the North American Baptists. If you don't accept those beliefs, how can you be part of the North American Baptists, let alone be a systematic theologian within the North American Baptist tradition? It's a fair question. Well, the next thing to note is, so what this document is doing here is, let's say, for example, Matthew 25, it's appealing to everlasting punishment with respect to where Jesus refers to everlasting punishment in Matthew 25, verses 41 and 46. But in fact, the Greek there, aionios, which is translated as everlasting in some Bible translations, is in fact a word that doesn't entail, it certainly doesn't require a never-ending existence, but rather a long period of time. It comes from the same root from which we get the English word eon, which is a long period of time. The real idea of translating Matthew 25, verses 41 and 46 as entailing everlasting in terms of never-ending, eternal existence really comes from Augustine's argument that if life is never-ending and this is being contrasted and compared to life, then this state of being must be never-ending as well. And I'll just say that that is a theological argument. It's not a direct reading of Scripture. And I think it's a less than compelling theological argument for several reasons, including the one that the annihilationists will point out, that what Jesus is doing here is as much contrast as comparing. So while he is comparing the state of judgment to the state of life, it doesn't mean that if the one is never-ending, never ceasing existence, the other state must be as well. It could be final and never-ending in the sense that there's finality to it, but not that it is perpetual existence. And that was a point that I think, among others, John Stott made effectively very many years ago in his book, Evangelical Essentials. And the same kind of points can be made in respect to Revelation 20 and the complexities of interpreting this highly symbolic apocalyptic text. What this means then, first of all, is that you can just sign off on something as it's written if you want, or you can push back on it and engage with it. And here's the interesting thing, why I love being a Baptist, because in fact, the whole idea of being a Baptist is that there is such a thing as soul competency, that we as individuals have a responsibility within community to work out our theology in fear and trembling. And that gives us the space and the autonomy that when we have concerns about something within a statement such as this statement of belief, that we can express reservations and qualifications to it. Now, this brings me to a broader question or comment about the function within the ecclesiological reality, the community of faith, of a statement of beliefs like this. It's not a creed. It's not like the Apostles' Creed, where you are expected to affirm the general resurrection, the creation, Trinity, second coming, and all of these things. You just have to affirm these things as written. This is a much longer 5-page statement, and it is one that functions, I believe, more as a centering document than a boundary document. In other words, you can't simply say, because you've got a reservation or qualification about one or two sentences within this 5-page document, that thereby is going to place you outside of the community of faith. Rather, what it does is invite a deeper conversation, which is, how does this document center us? And I believe how this document centers us is, in terms of this final section 9 on ecclesiology, of eschatology, is that Jesus is at the end of history. God's kingdom will come in its fullness. There will be a posthumous judgment. And within that context, God's kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven. The details of what that posthumous judgment is going to look like, whether as the eternal conscious torment or infernalist theorist advocates, whether it entails never-ending existence in hell forever of suffering, or whether it could entail a resurrection and judgment that results in the cessation of existence, as the annihilationist would propose, is a conversation that happens within the church. And this brings me to my last point on this. The evidence that you have for which conversations are allowed and which are not allowed is one that you can only get to by knowing Christian, or in this case, North American Baptist communities. So, for example, where you've got a statement within this statement of beliefs that requires belief in the general resurrection of Jesus. We have evidence that you can't be a North American Baptist leader in good standing and deny the resurrection of Jesus. So the resurrection of Jesus is recognized by adherents within the community as one within the centering document, which is so essential to the DNA of the community that you can't deny that and remain in good standing within the community. Now, it doesn't mean that if you end up rejecting the resurrection of Jesus, that you're not allowed to go to church anymore, that they're going to bar the door to you. But it may mean that you can't maintain the same level of participation. Maybe you can't take communion anymore, or maybe you can't be a member or be a deacon or something else. Those doors are going to be closed to you because this confession is so much part of the DNA. But when it comes to the interpretation of Matthew 25 and Revelation 20 as entailing eternal conscious torment, then that is something I think that very much is not part of the DNA of the community as such. And the evidence for that is the fact that you could have an outspoken advocate of annihilationism, such as myself, or my current pastor at the church I attend, which is a North American Baptist church, or the previous head pastor at that same church, all of whom have been annihilationists. The fact that we can flourish within the community is demonstration in and of itself that the way that this statement of belief functions within this community is such that it is centering you, but this is not one of the essential confessions in the centering function of the document. So to conclude, I've had a lot of theological evolution over the years, a lot of theological development, from a very uncritical acceptance of eternal conscious torment, of disembodied souls, through now to an annihilationist view of a general resurrection to judgment that results in the cessation of existence, but seasoned with a heady dose of, gosh, I hope I'm wrong and universalism is correct. And I think that for me, that is a very healthy theological space to be in. And I find that I can flourish within a North American Baptist community with that confession, even though the statement of beliefs within that community in and of itself refers to everlasting punishment.